Hello everyone and welcome to the Sydneyist, a weekly conversation about the city we love. Our motto here at the Sydneyist is much curiosity, a smidgen of cheek and definitely no whinging. I'm here in the Alan Slate studio at Eastside Radio with Sophie Kennedy-White, our producer, and we are broadcasting from Eastside Radio 89.7 FM or streaming on eastsidefm.org. Tonight we're talking about apartments, specifically why so few Sydney apartments, despite the avalanche of apartments that has hit Sydney over recent years, are designed for actual human beings with actual human lives. Before we come to that, though, a few snippets of news. Next week, from the 5th of August, is National Homelessness Week. The Salvos report now 122,000 people in Australia are experiencing homelessness. And of course, this cold weather underlines just how dreadful that must be. The Sydney Morning Herald reports the axing by the New South Wales government of a $39 million school upgrade program that was supposed to upgrade 30 schools and build 100 new public preschools. Although I have to say that seems like an awful lot for $39 million. Nevertheless, the program has been axed and referred to ICAC. In a revelation that has been at least a decade coming, The Guardian reports an epidemic of mass cheating in Australian universities and the routine awarding of prestigious degrees to students with, and I quote, no basic grasp of English. And finally, a chronic shortage of family-friendly apartments is driving many calls for more three-bed apartments to be mandated by councils and other control authorities, which brings us to our topic du jour, apartment design. I'm Elizabeth Farrelly, here with you on the Sydneyist, and my guest this evening is Professor Philip Oldfield, Head of Architecture at the University of New South Wales. Philip, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
That is an absolute pleasure. In February this year, Philip, you wrote with some other academics and published a paper with the fairly anodyne title, I thought, of Understanding the Layout of Apartments in Sydney. But it got rather a lot of attention, this article, because the subtitle was Meeting the Needs, whether apartments are meeting the needs of developers rather than residents, which is rather a spoiler, but is that what's happening with Sydney apartments?
Well, we like to give the game away in the title, so you don't have to read all 8,000 words. So the paper focused particularly on one group of residents, and that was families with children. And I should, like a good academic, acknowledge my self-interest here in that I live in an apartment with two children and my partner as well. So, but the research was led by a PhD student called Hyungmei Yang. Now, Dr. Hyungmei Yang, co-supervised by myself and Professor Hazel Easthope. And Hyungmei was really interested in, he had moved here from South Korea. And he was asking, why do all our apartments look the same? So that was the starting point of his research. And like all good research, it evolved a little bit over time. And then he wanted to ask this question that, if all apartments look the same, are they meeting the diverse needs of families with children effectively? And that's where, and the long story short is no, what we're building does not meet the diverse needs of families with children. And we know that the vast majority of apartments are designed and built without families with children in mind.
So let's look at the first question, which is also interesting. Why do they all look the same? Do we know the answer to that?
So I think there's a number of factors at play there. When Hyungmei interviewed developers, so he interviewed a number of developers for his research, what he found was, and what they were quite explicit were, they'd like to design with generalness in mind. and that was the literal word.
The general human being. Yes.
Well, for because developers, or the private developers at least, they are seeking to build to sell. And a large proportion of the sales go to owner investors. And owner investors want generalness. They want large open plan. They want decent view. They want the key kind of parameters, simple and general, en suites. And they have
it's
to
just depressing, isn't it?
Well, they have to sell, to get the money to build. They have to sell a certain percentage off plans, so they've got to hit this kind of generalness. And families with children make up 25% of apartment dwellers in New South Wales, so 1 in 4. So they're a big group, but they're not the biggest group.
Yes.
And then there's preconceptions as well that, families with children don't want to live in apartments. And so we'll build 1 and 2 bedders and we'll make them general. So that's one of the factors. I think there's other factors as well. There's a piece of legislation in New South Wales called the Apartment Design Guide, which sets quite prescriptive requirements. They're good requirements. They're things like making sure we have natural light and ventilation, but they often result in a degree of kind of repetition, I think.
Well, yes, they might be good requirements. I do remember asking a developer recently why his building, which otherwise I thought was lovely, unusually, had these awful top-hung windows which open about 4 inches, and that almost no air in, which in Sydney is an absolute nightmare because you can't get any proper ventilation. He said, well, look at the design guide and the building regs, and I think, I don't know if it's actually true or if it's just easier because of the rules or cheaper because of the rules, but it has become almost universal that all new apartments have those dreadful windows, and I think they should, personally think they should be banned. So do you know the answer to that? Why do we have that sameness? Because it's depressing.
I certainly think that some of the prescriptive regulation in the codes and in the kind of planning regs plays a role. And I think, the Apartment Design Guide, there's actually really robust evidence it's having a generally positive impact on apartments.
I know architects think that, yes.
But I know I spoke to some developers a couple of days ago who were complaining that it's so prescriptive, it can be limiting. One of the things in the Apartment Design Guide, for example, is you have to have 2 hours of daylight between 12 and 3, I think it is. Now, most of us are at work between 12 and 3. So again, I do think the ADG, the Apartment Design Guide, is 10 years old now. There's an opportunity to review it and to tweak it. I mean, the fundamentals that are there, things like bedrooms with no windows are not permissible.
No, they're not, really, but they still get built. I've seen some of those, so that's weird.
They shouldn't do.
I know they shouldn't. I think it's really, it's you get this funny room that doesn't have any windows and you're not really allowed to call it a bedroom, but of course agents do. So there's that sort of loophole, I guess.
I think they tend to be dormitories, or they tend to somehow characterise them as dormitories to get round it. So people will always try and get round minimum regulations as well. There'll be
dormitory means sleeping room.
Every trick in the book, I'm sure, gets played around.
So,
that.
Question about. Well, I still want to pursue this aesthetic question for a minute because it's Sydney. Was initially built mostly of terrace houses, which are very repetitive, but they're very repetitive in a very varied way, which is really charming and quite different from the UK, where you get much more. You get a row of 100 all the same quite often. But here they were built in 2s and 3s and 4s, and so you get these funny little quirks, and there'll be 3 of them and then 4 of them and then 1 like that and then a bit of a twist. And I think that gives Sydney a lot of its charm. So repetition by itself isn't a bad thing, but it's noticeable when you look, for example, in real estate, advertisements, that every apartment interior and most of the exteriors just look the same. Everything, and it's true of every city. It could be, when you look at, it could be in any city, in any part of any city, there's no flavour difference anywhere. Why is that? Is that enforced by regulations, or is that some sort of architectural fashion, or is it the economics of development?
I think it's all three, isn't it? I mean, it's a number of factors that go at play. So regulation can be quite prescriptive. That puts particular limits on things. I think that the kind of consolidation of sites, you end up with big sites. And often that you get repetition due to the sheer scale of, a developer may have a huge amount of, consolidated land. And so they tend to think repetition,
should we have a rule that says, if you have a site bigger than X, you have to use, 4 architects, not 1, or
possibly. I mean, but at the same time, I used to live in Chicago, and there were these type of buildings called the quarter block buildings. So it was quarter of a block, big, massive buildings, incredibly repetitive, but really beautiful, well detailed, well considered. So I think repetition can be a great
beautiful
thing.
Would be
well, beautiful is a provocative word in any kind of architectural discussion, but I think aesthetics are important, and I think a lot of people have said, saying, well, they're not important in the rhetoric at the moment, but I think they are. People want aesthetic environments. We look at things and we judge things.
So there's not a rule, presumably, that says all walls have to be white, or not even white. It's that kind of off-white that developers like, not quite white. Or, who says all buildings they all have the same kind of, the sort of blue or green glass as a rule. They all have the same kind of materials. You get mostly white and a bit of charcoal and possibly some faux timber detailing. And that's kind of it. And just about everything built in Sydney in the last 15 years looks like that. So there's got to be a fashion element, don't you think, in that?
Possibly a fashion element.
Because you don't get anything with red walls or blue walls or weirdness or funny shaped windows or just anything odd or eccentric.
I think there's definitely a bit of fashion in there. There's definitely a bit of angst about any design risk in there. And look, there's definitely regulations. So things like the environmental regulations say you've got to have slightly tinted windows, and that's why you end up with a lot of the windows having that slight tint of blue/grey. That's to bounce the heat away. Where in reality you could put shading above it. You can have a lower kind of iron glass, and you can have something much more transparent as well. But
much
regulation,
more attractive and much more articulated.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, look, let's get on to the question of families, because that is kind of key, isn't it? Because even though there are some 3-bedroom apartments, am I right in thinking that most of them are in the wrong place for families because they're in the expensive bits of Sydney, whereas most families, young families, have to live elsewhere?
Well, we don't know where all families live, but what we do know is there are very few 3-bedders out there. And
what sort of percentage?
So I think the ABC found it changes per LGA. So it's as low as 6% in some LGAs. My colleague, Dr. Sophie May Kerr, did some research around Liverpool LGA, and she found, for example, I think 50% of people living in apartments are families with children.
Wow.
50%, 1 in 2. But I think only 11 to 12% were 3-bedders.
So people are sort of squishing their children into shared rooms.
I'm squishing my kids into shared rooms as well. So I'm, as I say, I have skin in the game in there. And and I think we've got to acknowledge, though, not every family wants to live in an apartment. But increasingly they do, because there's opportunity for proximity to places of work, proximity to places of culture. And as a demographic, they are locked out of this design game. And it's increasingly difficult. The 3-bedders are like hen's teeth, I keep saying. They're really rare. And that means they're expensive, and that means it's really challenging. So in terms of an option for a family, well, look, you can either spend $1.5 million on a 3-bedroom, which is extremely limiting, or you can move to a different neighbourhood. And if you've lived in a particular neighbourhood while your kids are young and you've grown up in that community, your options to stay there might be really limited.
So one of the things that your paper noted was the absence of the old-fashioned corridor. That's interesting, isn't it? So the open plans become mandatory and universal.
And what we found was, I think it's about 55% of families with children preferred the lobby or the corridor. And anyone who's had kids will know the reason for this. You need some kind of buffer zone to get the shoes off, get the coats off, calm them down before you move in. Whereas developers wanted big open plan wow factor straight away. And so when we ask families what they want, it's very rarely things like wow factor. It's not necessarily sea views or granite worktops. It's storage.
Yep, storage.
We want somewhere to put the the stuff that comes along with kids. Want storage. Want acoustic separation. Yes. Because kids make noise. We want often things like a lobby or even like a non-open plan kitchen. or non-open plan dining room, some kind of spatial segregation so you can manage your children. And things we found as well were, depending on the children's age, there's different spatial layouts that were preferred. If your children are much younger, the bedrooms together make sense. If your children are teenagers, you want the bedrooms apart. And so there were kind of mini narratives in there which were just not being picked up in the design space.
Do we know that it strikes me that this is quite a modern or contemporary phenomenon, and that traditional apartments in cultures that traditionally have apartments, like a lot of parts of Europe and the UK, have a much more sophisticated, perhaps, or looser approach to apartment design, where there are, different rooms and corridors and separation and sort of choices about how you use space, and often higher ceilings and bigger windows, and just, you watch movies set in those places and you just get apartment envy because you think, oh, that's nice, we could live like that. But you see, you just don't see those at all here. Is that because developers are just, let's say, mean or profit driven? I mean, I know that, we rely on developers wholly to deliver everything. Is that the problem?
Look, it's part of the problem, and I think the private sector can deliver great housing. It often does, but it's a real challenge for them to deliver great housing for everybody. It's a real, this is a wicked problem we face in the kind of housing sector. What we often find, if you ask me where the best apartments are being built around the world at the moment, I think they're probably in places like Paris and Barcelona, and they're often social housing. Now, why do I think that? It's because, in the conventional kind of private delivery model, the architect is designing generic apartments. In social housing, cohabited housing, co-ops and things, the architect can talk to the people who live there. And can deliver what they want. The client and the architect, that relationship is much closer.
Isn't that interesting? You might expect that to be the opposite, because, architects tend to think of social housing as being generic and a bit boring for that reason, I think. But so a question before we get off the developer question, should we, if we wanted to encourage the private market to produce more interesting, more varied apartments, it would be better advised to have fewer rules or more rules?
Better rules.
Better rules.
Is that a typical academic way out of answering that one?
Sounds a bit like fudging it.
I think one of the things we talk about is
wiser rules.
Is there a need for, let's say, 20% of apartments in any development should be family friendly? So bigger 2-bedders with storage or 3-bedders. And I think that's generally a good idea. But I also understand that the amount of rules they are adding up. And so we either need to reduce some of the rules or we incentivize. We provide greater incentives, higher. You can build an extra floor if you develop X amount of family-friendly apartments. That might be an option. I do think we need to review all the rules to make sure they're working for us,
Can you legislate for variety?
Can you? That's an excellent question. And I do not, off the top of my head, know the answer to that. I think you can encourage variety. I think so. Certainly in terms of the number of bedrooms and the different people who live there. Now, if you go to somewhere like Singapore, 80% of people live in social housing in Singapore. A lot of repetition in there. But there's a lot of kind of social engineering in Singapore, where in any development, the Singaporean government engineer in some ways the different ethnicities and the different, you'll have some young couples, you'll have some families, and they control that to ensure there is diversity. Now, that probably wouldn't be palatable here, but there are mechanisms that different places follow.
Interesting, isn't it? That is a good moment for us to move into a quick music break. That was a track called Home and Broken Hearted by Mick Thomas and the Roving Commission from an album called Back in the Day. I'm Elizabeth Farrelly with you on the Sydneyist at Eastside Radio 89.7 FM or eastsidefm.org. And I'm speaking here with Professor Oldfield, Professor Philip Oldfield, the head of architecture at University of New South Wales. Philip, social housing is the other topic du jour, I suppose, and one of the things I want to ask you first is definitional, if that's a word. Social housing means different things to different people. Sometimes it means public housing, which is to say publicly owned housing. Sometimes it means affordable housing, which usually means housing that is somehow subsidised. What is social housing exactly?
This is an excellent question, and there's lots of different definitions. I mean, I look at it as there's lots of different definitions, in different places, but effectively it's some form of subsidised housing, and typically it's subsidised rented housing. I mean, but I think broader than just social housing, there's a number of other models which I'd say are not for profit, or which may not be social housing per se, but provide opportunities as well.
Which is what we call community housing.
Well, not right? Just community housing, but things like the Nightingale kind of housing, which are effectively, we won't make any profit on this housing. Yeah. And you
it's a sort of social enterprise.
You can buy this housing, and then you can sell it in the future, but you're not going to make... there's a deal made where you're not going to make much profit off there.
So we agree not to see our houses as commodities.
Well, it is about kind of this shift away from, as you say, the housing as commodity to housing as a home, which is fundamental. And
that seems like quite a healthy thing to me. And it's lovely that Nightingale has proved so hugely popular in Melbourne because it suggests that people are starting to think differently, perhaps.
I think some of the best housing built in Australia recently is the Nightingale in Melbourne. I mean, Nightingale Place, I think it's the Andrew Maynard building, and you might know it and your listeners might know it. It's got beautiful kind of yellow hints on it. We talked before about...
It was the second time.
Well, we talked before about the lack of colour and the lack of vibrancy. It's this bright yellow, but it's beautifully documented and detailed. It's got a terraced roof garden. It's got open kind of corridors to allow breezes through. Everything's naturally ventilated. And look, I can give you the quantitative stuff as well. So we know that any building built when Nightingale Place was built had to have a minimum environmental kind of rating of 6 stars in NATAS. That building was 9.3 stars.
Wow, that's pretty good. They're very impressive, aren't they? Because they're sort of a built argument for the power of design, really, and because they are much cheaper than normal apartments, and yet they're hugely popular because they're cheaper, but also because they look fabulous, and they're all different. I think there are 12 or something completed buildings now in Melbourne, and there's a few in South Australia and one in Marrickville and Sydney, although that's slightly different. But the architecture, however varied, is universally really stylish, isn't it? And that is an argument. I suppose it's an argument for architecture. So is that something that you, as an academic, are teaching? Course?
I mean, housing is really popular with students. And
is that housing generally, or sort of social housing, or all of the above?
Social housing. We have social housing studios. We have housing studios. We actually have in our Masters of Architecture, we have a dedicated housing stream. And in that stream, students do housing finance courses, housing market courses. We take students to Vienna to see the social housing, and they do housing studios as well, where they design with celebrated housing architects, understanding proper layouts and how we facilitate comfort and homeliness.
Because it was the case, wasn't it, post Second War in Europe and the UK, and a bit later than that here, that social housing design was a sort of a cause with architects. It was very fashionable, and then it kind of went out of fashion, and it was like nobody would touch it.
Well, in that kind of post-war period, you had this amazing kind of experimentation
And all the best young architects went to do it.
Yeah, all the world famous architects dabbled in social housing, and you had things like duplexes, triplexes, hit and miss corridors, and all these innovative kind of arrangements.
Scissor plans,
which we don't see anymore.
No, no one's playing with that.
No one's playing with that, and they had benefits and they had disbenefits, but certainly there was a lot of design thinking and a lot of design, kind of consideration around housing. Then it went out of...
Do you think that was politically led? Do you think that was like there was a lot of money from governments and so architects went that way? Or do you think it was the other way around?
I think it was politically led and disciplinary led at the same time. Certainly in the UK, a lot of architects worked for local councils at that point.
And it was such
like 50%
a big thing.
Of architects.
And the LCC was so kind of fashionable. Sydney has a long tradition, though, of high-quality public housing, a lot of which originated in the early part of the 20th century. And I'm thinking of Strickland Flats in Chippendale and the high street houses in Millers Point and Ways Terrace in Pyrmont. And they're all different. They're quite eccentric in their design, quite particular and flavoursome in that sense. We don't see that anymore, do we? What we do see is very kind of run-of-the-mill and you will live in a box sort of thing. Or do you think that's changing?
I think well, maybe I'm looking through rose-tinted glasses now, but I'm starting to see that change, certainly internationally, and I look at the kind of social housing that's going up in Paris, Barcelona. Even there was a great project in LA recently, of all places, and you can start to see this coming back. Again, maybe I'm being the optimistic.
Well, there are some lovely, and there's a wonderful example in Chile, in Santiago of Aravena, who did those sort of half houses. I think that, and people could sort of complete their own, build a few extra bedrooms when they got the money. Meantime, they lived in a sort of a skeleton house, which I just thought, and they became, because of that, but they became very particularized to the people. Well, if you had to choose one example that was a really good one that Sydney could follow, do you have a favourite?
So it's a difficult one. I think Barcelona resonates with me in particular because 10 years ago, I think they were in a similar boat to Sydney. 2% social housing existed, big challenges, and then local government decided, they enacted, forgot what it's actually called, but it essentially says housing is a human right.
Yes.
Right, a policy that says housing is a human right. We need 30% social housing in new developments. They bought up vacant housing, they bought up private housing, and they started to build much more social housing. And what kind of sits in my head?
Government or council building?
It's a kind of Barcelona local government.
Yes.
It's a kind of city council scale.
Yeah.
But what the project that sits in my head is a project for homeless women, temporary housing for homeless women. In Barcelona. It's made out of solid timber, beautifully evocative project, gorgeous fit out, gorgeous, balconies. And if you can provide that level of design quality, for homeless people, that says something.
It's so European, isn't it? Even to use words like socialism, like in Paris, where they've got 25% social housing, and it's very impressive. We are about to have to wrap that up. I'm so sorry. Just when the conversation's getting going. I'm Elizabeth Farrelly, and I've been talking with Philip Oldfield from the University of New South Wales about apartment living and how it could be more interesting and also more adaptable for us as humans. We're handing over now to Yone on the Vinyl Frontier. Thanks for joining us on The Sydneyist.